The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ravencourt Palace, creating rivulets that blurred the view of the sprawling gardens below. Princess Isabella stood in the blue drawing room, her fingers tracing the cold glass as she watched the storm gather strength. The weather seemed to mirror the tempest brewing within the palace walls, a storm that threatened to tear apart everything she held dear. Isabella had called this palace home for 3 years now, ever since her marriage to Prince Alexander. The grand halls that once intimidated her had become familiar corridors where she walked with purpose, where she had learned to navigate the intricate web of royal protocol and centuries-old traditions. But today, those same halls felt like a prison, and the weight of the crown that would one day rest upon her head felt heavier than ever. "Your Highness," came a soft voice from behind her. Isabella turned to see Margaret, her lady-in-waiting, approaching with careful steps. Margaret's usually bright demeanor was subdued, her eyes reflecting the same worry that had been plaguing the entire household staff for weeks. "The cars are ready," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your luggage has been loaded, and security has confirmed the route to the airport." Isabella nodded, though her heart felt like lead in her chest. She had known this day would come, had been preparing for it since the urgent telegram arrived from her homeland of Astoria 2 weeks ago. The political situation there had deteriorated rapidly, with rebel factions threatening to overthrow the government. As the daughter of Astoria's ruling family, Isabella's presence was desperately needed to help stabilize the region. "And Prince Alexander?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. Margaret's expression grew even more pained. "He's been in emergency sessions with the Prime Minister and the Defense Council all morning. The situation with Astoria has implications for our own national security. He's trying to find a way for you to stay, Your Highness." Isabella closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that had been threatening all morning. She knew Alexander would exhaust every diplomatic channel, would leverage every alliance and treaty to avoid this separation. But duty called, just as it had called her ancestors before her. Some responsibilities transcended personal happiness, even for royalty. "Has Queen Vivienne been informed of my departure time?" Isabella asked, straightening her shoulders in an attempt to project the composure expected of her station. Margaret hesitated for a moment. "Yes, Your Highness," she expressed her regrets about the circumstances. Isabella caught the careful phrasing. She had long ago learned to read the subtle language of court, where true feelings were rarely expressed directly. Queen Vivienne, Alexander's stepmother, had never quite warmed to Isabella despite 3 years of marriage. While she maintained the perfect facade of a supportive mother-in-law in public, Isabella had noticed the cool glances, the subtle undermining of her initiatives, and the way conversations seemed to pause when she entered a room. The Queen had married Alexander's father, King Edmund, 5 years after the death of Alexander's beloved mother. While the marriage had been politically advantageous, bringing together 2 powerful European houses, it had never been a love match. Queen Vivienne was ambitious, calculated, and had her own vision for the future of the monarchy, a vision that didn't always align with the path Alexander and Isabella had chosen together. "Your Highness," Margaret said gently, "perhaps you should rest before the journey. It will be a long flight to Astoria." Isabella shook her head. "I won't be able to rest until I see him. Until I can explain." She trailed off. I. She trailed off, knowing that no explanation would make this any easier for either of them. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor made both women turn. Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled from hours of intense meetings. His dark hair was tousled, his tie loosened, and there were lines of exhaustion etched around his blue eyes. At 32, he carried himself with the natural authority of someone born to rule. But today, Isabella could see the weight of helplessness in his posture. "Margaret, please give us a moment," he said quietly. As soon as they were alone, Alexander crossed the room in swift strides and pulled Isabella into his arms. She melted into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with the faint smell of the leather from his study, where he'd been conducting his meetings. "Tell me there's been a breakthrough," she whispered against his chest. Alexander's arms tightened around her. "I've spoken with every ally we have. The French president, the German chancellor, even reached out to the American Secretary of State. Everyone agrees that the situation in Astoria needs immediate attention, but they won't commit troops or resources without a member of the royal family present to legitimize the intervention, Isabella finished. Your cousin Prince Marcus is too young, and your uncle is too ill to travel. It has to be you. Alexander's voice was thick with frustration. The rebels have specifically stated they'll only negotiate with you or your father, since your father refuses to leave his bunker. Isabella pulled back to look into his eyes. You know I have to go. I know, Alexander said, cupping her face in his hands. God, how I know. But that doesn't make this any easier. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to remain composed. They had been through separations before. Royal duties often demanded travel, but never anything like this. The situation in Astoria was volatile and dangerous. Communications were spotty, and there was no guarantee when she would be able to return. The rebels controlled key infrastructure, and even with international support, the conflict could drag on for months or even years. I've been thinking, Alexander said, his voice taking on the tone he used when formulating policy. Perhaps we could arrange for secure video conferences. I could work with the Commonwealth Office to establish a direct line that bypasses the compromised networks in Astoria. Isabella smiled sadly. You're trying to solve this with technology and diplomacy. But we both know this is bigger than communication protocols. She was right, and Alexander knew it. This separation would test their marriage in ways they had never anticipated. They would be governing different kingdoms, dealing with different crises, surrounded by different advisors who might not always have their relationship's best interests at heart. When I married you, Alexander said, I promised to support you in everything. Your duties to Astoria are part of who you are, and I won't ask you to abandon your people, no matter how much I want to. And when I married you, Isabella replied, I promised to stand by your side. Leaving feels like breaking that promise. You're not leaving me. You're fulfilling your obligations to your homeland, which makes you the woman I fell in love with. Alexander's words were brave, but Isabella could see the pain behind them. A soft knock interrupted them. Your Highness, came Margaret's voice through the door. I'm terribly sorry, but the security team says we must depart within the hour to maintain the flight schedule. Isabella and Alexander looked at each other, both knowing that their private time was being measured in minutes now, not hours or days. There's something else, Alexander said, his expression darkening. Intelligence suggests that some members of the royal court here may be pleased by your departure. Isabella's stomach clenched. Vivienne, I don't have proof, Alexander said quickly. But there have been whispers. Some believe that your absence will allow for certain adjustments to be made to our domestic policies. Isabella had been spearheading several progressive initiatives since becoming princess. Modernizing the monarchy's approach to social issues, expanding educational opportunities for women, and establishing stronger ties with Commonwealth nations. These efforts had won her tremendous public support but had ruffled feathers among some traditional elements within the court. She's been waiting for an opportunity like this, Isabella said, pieces clicking into place. With me gone, she can influence you and the king to reverse the changes we've implemented. She can try, Alexander said firmly. But she underestimates both my commitment to our work and my resistance to manipulation. Even as he spoke, both knew the challenges ahead. Queen Vivienne was skilled at court politics, had years of experience building alliances, and understood how to exploit periods of uncertainty. With Isabella thousands of miles away, dealing with a crisis that could consume all her time and attention, Vivienne would have unprecedented access to influence policy. Promise me something, Isabella said, gripping Alexander's hands tightly. Don't let her undo everything we've worked for. The literacy programs, the mental health initiatives, the Commonwealth partnerships, these matter to people. I promise, Alexander said. But I need you to promise me something too. Don't let this crisis change who you are. Don't let the pressure to end the conflict quickly push you into decisions that compromise your values. Isabella nodded, understanding the deeper concern. In crisis situations, it was tempting to make expedient choices that seemed justified by circumstances, but that could have lasting negative consequences. Another knock, more insistent this time. Your Highness, the security team is quite concerned about the weather affecting flight conditions if we delay much longer. Isabella and Alexander exchanged one final look. The time for private conversation was over. Now they had to face the public nature of their goodbye. The cameras that would capture every expression. The analysis that would dissect their body language for signs of weakness or strength. Are you ready to face them? Alexander asked. Isabella straightened, and Alexander watched as she transformed from his wife into the princess the world expected to see. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and the vulnerable woman who had been crying in his arms moments before became the composed royal, ready to address her duties. I'm ready, she said. As they walked together toward the main entrance where the cars waited, Isabella felt the weight of history on her shoulders. She was not the first royal to choose duty over personal happiness, and she would not be the last. But the knowledge that her ancestors had faced similar trials provided little comfort as she prepared to leave behind everything she had built in her new homeland. The great hall was lined with palace staff who had gathered to see her off. Their faces were solemn, and many of the women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Isabella had always made it a point to know the staff personally, to ask about their families, and remember important events in their lives. Seeing their genuine distress at her departure made her departure feel even more real. King Edmund waited near the entrance, his age more apparent than usual in the gravity of the situation. At 74, he had seen many crises, but this one struck particularly close to home, because it involved not just political considerations, but his beloved daughter-in-law. My dear, he said, taking Isabella's hands in his aged ones, I want you to know that you go with our full support and our prayers. Astoria is fortunate to have you. Thank you, Your Majesty, Isabella replied. I promise to represent both kingdoms with honor. Queen Vivienne stood slightly apart from the main group, perfectly dressed as always in a tailored navy suit that emphasized her elegant figure. At 48, she remained strikingly beautiful, with the kind of refined features that photographed well and the practiced smile of someone comfortable in the public eye. Isabella, she said, approaching with measured steps. Such a difficult situation for all of us. You must be so worried about your family. The words were appropriate, but Isabella caught something else in Queen Vivienne's tone, a note that suggested the queen was less troubled by the situation than she appeared. Thank you for your concern, Your Majesty. I know you'll take good care of Alexander while I'm away. Of course, Queen Vivienne replied smoothly. He'll have all the support he needs to manage his responsibilities here. The emphasis on here was subtle but clear. While Isabella dealt with foreign crises, Queen Vivienne would be helping to shape domestic policy. It was a division of influence that played perfectly into the Queen's long-term strategic goals. The head of security approached, his expression professionally neutral but urgent. Your Highness, we really must depart now. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and air traffic control has limited windows for departure. Isabella nodded, knowing that this was the moment she had been dreading. The goodbye that would be captured by cameras, analyzed by commentators, and remembered by history. She turned to Alexander one final time. Protocol demanded restraint in public displays of affection, but the situation called for something more than a formal handshake. Alexander stepped forward and took her hands, bringing them to his lips in a gesture that was both public enough to be appropriate and intimate enough to convey his deeper feelings. Come back to me, he said quietly. Words meant only for her ears. Always, she replied. As Isabella walked toward the waiting car, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The staff, the security team, the royal family, all watching as she took each step toward an uncertain future. But it was the gaze she felt most keenly that came from Queen Vivienne. Isabella didn't need to turn around to know that the Queen was watching with particular interest, perhaps already planning the changes she would implement in Isabella's absence. The car door closed with a heavy finality, and as the motorcade pulled away from Ravencourt Palace, Isabella pressed her face to the window for one last look at the home she was leaving behind. In the distance, she could see Alexander standing in the doorway, his figure growing smaller as they drove away. And beside him, barely visible but unmistakably present, was Queen Vivienne. Even from this distance, Isabella could see that while Alexander's posture spoke of loss and worry, Queen Vivienne's stance suggested something quite different, something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. The royal jet lifted off from Heathrow, just as the storm reached its full fury, and Isabella watched through the small porthole as London disappeared beneath a blanket of dark clouds. The turbulence that shook the aircraft seemed to echo the upheaval in her heart, each bump and jolt a reminder of the stable ground she was leaving behind. Captain Morrison, the head of her security detail, approached her seat with the latest intelligence briefing. His weathered face carried the grim expression of a man who had seen too many conflicts, and Isabella knew the news wouldn't be encouraging. "Your Highness," he said quietly, settling into the seat across from her. "We've received updated reports from Astoria. The situation has deteriorated since this morning." Isabella set aside the book she had been pretending to read and gave him her full attention. "How much worse?" "Rebel forces have taken control of 3 more provinces overnight. They've cut telecommunications to the capital, and there are reports of government ministers being held under house arrest." Morrison paused, consulting his tablet. "Your cousin Prince Marcus managed to get word out through encrypted channels. He says your father is refusing to negotiate and is preparing for a siege of the royal compound." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations of royal responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her father, King Wilhelm of Astoria, was a proud man who had never backed down from a fight. But his stubbornness could doom their kingdom to a prolonged civil war. "What about international support?" she asked. "The United Nations is calling for emergency sessions, but you know how slowly those wheels turn. The European Union is split on whether to intervene militarily. Some members are concerned about setting precedents for interference in sovereign nations." Morrison's tone suggested he shared their frustration with diplomatic delays. "And Britain's position?" Morrison's expression grew even more grim. "Prince Alexander has been fighting for immediate aid, but there's resistance in Parliament. Some members question whether British resources should be committed to what they see as an internal Astorian matter." Isabella understood the subtext. Without her presence in London to maintain political relationships and rally support, the enthusiasm for helping Astoria was already beginning to wane. She had spent 3 years building alliances, attending countless dinners and charitable events, charming ministers and their wives, all to create the goodwill that could be leveraged in moments like this. "Captain," she said, "I need to know something, and I need complete honesty." Morrison nodded, recognizing the tone that meant she was about to ask a question that touched on matters beyond his official briefing. "Are there elements within the British court who might be pleased by this separation from Prince Alexander?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the tablet. As head of her security detail, he had access to intelligence that went beyond threats to her physical safety. He knew the political currents within the palace, the whispered conversations and subtle power plays. "Your Highness, there have been discussions among certain court advisors about the direction of domestic policy. Some feel that recent initiatives have moved too quickly, challenged too many established traditions." "Queen Vivienne's circle," Isabella said. "It wasn't a question." "I cannot make specific accusations," Morrison said carefully. "But yes, there are those who see opportunity in the current circumstances." Back at Ravencourt Palace, Prince Alexander stood in the same blue drawing room where Isabella had waited hours earlier, staring out at the rain that continued to lash the windows. The emptiness of the space seemed to mock him everywhere he looked. He saw reminders of his wife's presence: the chair where she always sat during their morning coffee, the small table where she kept her correspondence, the photographs they had taken during their last holiday in Scotland. "Alexander," came his father's voice from the doorway. King Edmund entered slowly, his cane tapping against the polished floor. "You should eat something. You've been standing there for 2 hours." "I keep thinking I should be doing something more," Alexander replied, without turning around. "There must be some diplomatic avenue I haven't explored, some pressure I can apply." "You've done everything possible," his father said gently. "The Prime Minister told me you've spoken with every world leader who would take your call. You've leveraged relationships built over decades. Sometimes, my son, We must accept that events are beyond our immediate control. Alexander finally turned, and his father was struck by how much older he looked. The boyish features that had made him popular with the public had hardened into something more mature, more weighted by responsibility. She's flying into a war zone, Alexander said. The intelligence reports are getting worse by the hour, and I'm standing here, powerless to protect her. She's not going in alone, King Edmund reminded him. She has security, diplomatic support, and the backing of multiple governments. Isabella is strong, Alexander. Stronger than perhaps even she realizes. Before Alexander could respond, Queen Vivienne appeared in the doorway. She had changed from her earlier formal attire into an elegant burgundy dress that seemed to emphasize her authority in the household. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, though her tone suggested she had every right to interrupt. But I thought we should discuss the arrangements for the coming weeks. King Edmund gestured for her to enter. Of course, we'll need to adjust many of our plans. Queen Vivienne moved into the room with practiced grace, positioning herself near the fireplace where the light from the flames highlighted her composed features. I've taken the liberty of speaking with the Lord Chamberlain about postponing or canceling some of Isabella's scheduled engagements. The charity luncheon next week, the hospital visit, the Commonwealth Women's Conference. We should honor as many of her commitments as possible, Alexander said quickly. She worked hard to establish those relationships. I understand your sentiment, Queen Vivienne replied smoothly. But we must be practical. These events require intensive preparation and personal attention that simply cannot be provided remotely. It would be better to postpone them properly than to offer a diminished experience. Alexander studied his stepmother's face, searching for the calculation he suspected lay beneath her reasonable words. Some of those events have been planned for months. The Commonwealth Conference alone represents years of diplomatic preparation, which is precisely why it deserves to be done properly when Isabella returns, Queen Vivienne said. In the meantime, we could focus on initiatives that are more immediately manageable. Such as? King Edmund asked. Queen Vivienne moved to the windows, gazing out at the storm with a thoughtful expression. The traditional autumn ceremonies, for instance, the presentation of honors, the ceremonial military reviews. These are events that demonstrate stability and continuity during uncertain times. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The events Queen Vivienne was suggesting were precisely the kind of formal, traditional ceremonies that Isabella had been working to modernize and balance with more progressive initiatives. The people expect to see change, Alexander said carefully. Isabella's programs have tremendous public support. The literacy initiative alone has helped thousands of families. Oh, I would never suggest abandoning such worthy causes, Queen Vivienne said, turning back to face them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But perhaps this is an opportunity to refine the approach. Make sure these programs are sustainable, properly integrated with existing institutions. The phrase, existing institutions, carried weight in royal circles. It was code for the traditional power structures that had felt threatened by some of Isabella's more innovative approaches. Mother, Alexander said he had called her that since his teenage years, though the relationship had never been entirely comfortable. I hope you're not suggesting we use Isabella's absence to undermine her work. Alexander, Queen Vivienne replied, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. I'm suggesting we use this time to strengthen the monarchy's position. Your wife is dealing with a crisis that could last months or even years. If we appear weak or divided here at home, it helps no one, not us, not Isabella, and certainly not the people of Astoria, who need our support. It was a skillful argument, wrapping self-interest in the language of duty and concern. Alexander recognized the tactic, but found it difficult to counter directly, without appearing to accuse his stepmother of ulterior motives. King Edmund, sensing the tension, attempted to moderate. Perhaps we should take these decisions case by case. Some events may need to be postponed. Others might be modified, and some could continue as planned. Of course, Queen Vivienne agreed readily. I simply think it would be wise to have a framework for making these decisions efficiently. With Alexander carrying additional responsibilities and dealing with the stress of separation from his wife, Perhaps it would be helpful if I took on a more active role in managing social and ceremonial functions. Alexander felt the trap closing around him. The suggestion was reasonable on its surface. Queen Vivienne had experience with court functions and protocol, but it would also give her unprecedented influence over the monarchy's public image and policy directions. I appreciate the offer, Alexander said, but I think it's important that I maintain direct oversight of all major decisions. Isabella trusted me to preserve what we've built together. Naturally, Queen Vivienne said. I would never suggest otherwise. I'm simply offering support during a difficult time. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Private Secretary Harrison entered with an expression that suggested urgent business. Your Highness, he said, addressing Alexander. We've received word from the aircraft. Princess Isabella has landed safely in Vienna for refueling, but there are complications with the final leg of her journey. Alexander straightened immediately. What kind of complications? Astorian airspace is contested, sir. Military air traffic control is routing all civilian flights through a single corridor, but rebel forces have been targeting aircraft. The princess's security detail is recommending a delay until safe passage can be guaranteed. How long a delay? King Edmund asked. Potentially several days, Your Majesty. They're exploring alternative routes through neighboring countries. Alexander ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of helplessness crushing down on him. Isabella was stuck in diplomatic limbo, unable to reach her destination, unable to return home, caught between two worlds like a piece on a chessboard. Sir, Harrison continued, there's more. We've received formal requests from several Commonwealth nations, asking for clarification on Britain's position regarding the Astorian conflict. Some are specifically asking whether Princess Isabella's initiatives will continue during her absence. This was exactly what Queen Vivienne had been anticipating. The uncertainty surrounding Isabella's programs was already creating diplomatic ripple effects. We'll issue a statement affirming our continued commitment to all existing programs, Alexander said firmly. With respect, sir, Harrison said. The Foreign Office is requesting more specific guidance. They need to know which commitments can be honored without the princess's direct involvement, and which may need to be adjusted. Queen Vivienne seized the opening. This is precisely why we need to establish clear protocols. We cannot afford to appear indecisive or unprepared. Alexander found himself nodding despite his reservations. The last thing the monarchy needed was to appear chaotic or unreliable to international partners. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Isabella sat in a sterile conference room at Vienna International Airport. Surrounded by maps, intelligence reports, and increasingly frustrated diplomatic personnel, the delay was more than just an inconvenience. Every hour she remained outside, Astoria was another hour the rebels could consolidate power, and another hour her father could make irreversible decisions. Ambassador Rothwell, the British envoy to Austria, had been briefing her on the developing situation. Your Highness, we're in contact with NATO Air Command about creating a secure corridor, but the political sensitivities are enormous. Nobody wants to appear to be taking sides in what could be characterized as an internal conflict. My people are dying, Isabella said, her composure finally cracking slightly. This isn't an abstract political exercise. Of course not, Your Highness, Rothwell replied quickly, but we must navigate the legal frameworks carefully to ensure long-term support for your cause. Isabella stood and walked to the window overlooking the airport tarmac. Other travelers moved through the terminal below, going about their normal lives while her world fell apart. She thought of Alexander, probably pacing the palace, trying to manage crises on multiple fronts while dealing with the emotional weight of their separation. Ambassador, she said without turning around. What intelligence do we have about the political situation in Britain? How is Prince Alexander managing? Rothwell hesitated. Your Highness, perhaps such matters are better discussed through secure channels, with your husband directly. Isabella turned sharply. That's not an answer. What aren't you telling me? Your Highness, there are discussions within certain circles about how to proceed with various initiatives during your absence. Some view this as an opportunity for reassessment. Queen Vivienne, Isabella said flatly. I cannot make specific accusations, Rothwell said, echoing Captain Morrison's earlier caution. But yes, There are those who see the current circumstances as favorable to their preferred policies. Isabella felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. She was trapped in diplomatic limbo while political enemies moved to undermine everything she and Alexander had worked to accomplish. "Get me a secure line to Ravencourt Palace," she said. "I need to speak with my husband immediately." Back in London, Alexander was finishing a tense meeting with the defense minister when his private secretary informed him of Isabella's call. He took it in his study, the same room where he had spent the morning trying to mobilize support for Astoria. "Darling." Isabella's voice came through clearly despite the encryption. But he could hear the strain beneath her composed tone. "Are you safe?" he asked immediately. "For now." "But Alexander? I'm hearing concerning reports about what's happening there. Tell me Queen Vivienne isn't using my absence to reverse our programs." Alexander looked toward the closed door of his study, knowing that just down the hall, his stepmother was probably meeting with advisors, laying groundwork for the very changes Isabella feared. "She's offering to take on additional responsibilities," he said carefully. "That's what I was afraid of." Isabella's voice carried a mix of frustration and sadness. "Alexander, you have to understand something. This delay could last days or even weeks. If Vivienne consolidates power now, it will be nearly impossible to restore the balance when I return." "I won't let that happen," Alexander said. But even as he spoke, he could feel the challenges ahead. Queen Vivienne was skilled at court politics, had years of experience, and understood how to present her initiatives as reasonable responses to changing circumstances. "Promise me," Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time since the crisis began. "Promise me that when I come home, I'll still have a home to come back to, that the work we've done together won't have been dismantled while I was trying to save my homeland." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of the responsibility she was placing on him. "I promise. Whatever it takes, I'll preserve what we've built." After the call ended, Alexander sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at photographs of himself and Isabella at various state functions. In every image, they appeared united, presenting a strong front to the world. But now, separated by thousands of miles and facing crises on multiple fronts, that unity would be tested in ways they had never imagined. Down the hall, Queen Vivienne was indeed meeting with advisors, but her expression was far from the satisfied smugness one might expect. Instead, she wore the focused look of a strategist, implementing a carefully planned campaign. "The key," she was telling Lord Pemberton, one of her longest-serving allies, "is to present everything as temporary measures designed to maintain stability during the crisis. Nothing can appear calculated or opportunistic." "And if Princess Isabella objects when she returns?" Lord Pemberton asked. Queen Vivienne smiled. And for the first time that day, there was genuine satisfaction in her expression. "If she returns soon enough to object effectively, but every day this crisis continues, every day she remains focused on Astorian affairs, is another day we have to establish new patterns, new expectations." As night fell over Ravencourt Palace, the stage was set for a struggle that would determine not just the future of the monarchy, but the kind of queen Isabella would be if and when she finally made it home. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella's tearful departure from Ravencourt Palace, and the ancient halls that had once echoed with her laughter now seemed to whisper with conspiracy. Prince Alexander stood in the cabinet room, surrounded by ministers and advisors whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to barely concealed impatience. The morning briefings had become exercises in diplomatic frustration, each day bringing news of further delays and complications. "The situation in Astoria remains deadlocked," Foreign Secretary Williams reported, his tone suggesting he had delivered this same assessment too many times before. "Princess Isabella has managed to establish contact with rebel leaders through intermediaries, but her father continues to refuse any form of negotiation." Alexander gripped the edge of the mahogany table. King Wilhelm's stubbornness was legendary even among European royalty, but his refusal to consider compromise was condemning his kingdom to a prolonged civil war that grew bloodier with each passing day. "What about the safe corridor through Hungarian airspace?" Alexander asked. "Still blocked by political complications," Williams replied. The Hungarian government is nervous about appearing to take sides. They're demanding guarantees about Princess Isabella's mission that we simply cannot provide. Defense Minister Crawford leaned forward, his weathered face grim. Sir, we need to consider the possibility that this situation could continue for months. The rebel factions are well organized and well funded. Our intelligence suggests foreign backing, possibly from elements hostile to British interests in the region. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Isabella remained trapped in diplomatic limbo indefinitely, the carefully balanced alliance between Britain and Astoria could crumble, taking with it years of strategic planning and economic cooperation. Surely there must be something we can do, Alexander said, though he could hear the desperation creeping into his own voice. Actually, came a smooth voice from the doorway. There might be. Queen Vivienne entered the room with the confident stride of someone who had timed her arrival perfectly. She carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression that suggested she possessed information the others lacked. Mother, Alexander said, straightening. What have you heard? I've been speaking with contacts in the Vatican, Queen Vivienne replied, settling into the chair traditionally reserved for visiting dignitaries. Cardinal Benedetti has close ties with several European refugee organizations. He believes there may be a way to get Isabella into Astoria through humanitarian corridors. Foreign Secretary Williams frowned. We've explored those options. The paperwork alone would take weeks, and there's no guarantee of safe passage. Ah, Queen Vivienne said, opening her portfolio with deliberate ceremony. But what if Princess Isabella traveled not as a member of the British royal family, but as a representative of an international relief organization? The Red Cross has been seeking high-profile advocates for their Astorian mission. The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity, and Alexander felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. But something in his stepmother's tone made him wary. What would be required? He asked carefully. Isabella would need to formally step back from all her official British duties for the duration of the mission, Queen Vivienne explained, her voice perfectly reasonable. She couldn't represent both the Crown and an independent humanitarian organization. The legal complications would be insurmountable. Alexander felt the trap closing around him once again. Queen Vivienne's suggestion would indeed get Isabella into Astoria, but it would also provide the perfect justification for suspending all of Isabella's programs and initiatives. By the time she returned to her royal duties, those programs could be thoroughly dismantled or restructured according to different priorities. How long would this suspension need to last? Defense Minister Crawford asked. Until the crisis is resolved, Queen Vivienne replied. It wouldn't be proper for her to resume royal duties while actively serving with a relief organization. The conflicts of interest would be significant. Alexander studied his stepmother's face, searching for any sign of the satisfaction he suspected she felt. But Queen Vivienne had years of practice at court politics, and her expression remained perfectly composed. The decision, of course, is yours, she continued, addressing Alexander directly. But every day we delay, the situation in Astoria worsens. How many people will die while we debate diplomatic niceties? It was masterfully done. Queen Vivienne had positioned herself as the advocate for decisive action, while making Alexander appear hesitant and indecisive if he refused to immediately embrace her solution. I need to discuss this with Isabella, Alexander said finally. Of course, Queen Vivienne agreed. Though I should mention that Cardinal Benedetti needs an answer within 48 hours. The Red Cross mission is scheduled to depart soon, and adding a high-profile advocate requires extensive security preparations. As the meeting dispersed, Alexander remained behind, staring at the portraits of his ancestors that lined the cabinet room walls, kings and queens who had faced wars, plagues, and political upheavals, all watching him with painted eyes that seemed to judge his every decision. Difficult choices, my son, came his father's voice from behind him. King Edmund entered slowly, his cane tapping against the marble floor. She's maneuvering me into an impossible position, Alexander said without turning around. If I agree to Vivienne's plan, Isabella gets to Astoria but loses everything she's built here. If I refuse, she remains trapped while people die. Your stepmother has always been strategically minded, King Edmund said diplomatically. But perhaps her motives matter less than the outcome. Isabella needs to reach her people. Alexander finally turned to face his father. And what happens to the monarchy she'll return to? Vivienne has been systematically replacing Isabella's staff with her own people. The literacy program has been temporarily suspended for reassessment. The Commonwealth Women's Conference has been cancelled entirely. End quote. Some changes might be necessary during a crisis, his father said gently. Father, whose side are you on? Alexander's question carried years of frustration with his family's willingness to accommodate Queen Vivienne's ambitions. King Edmund sighed deeply. I'm on the side of stability, Alexander. The monarchy has survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances. If Vivienne's approach helps us weather this storm, then we sacrifice Isabella's vision for the future, Alexander finished. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Isabella paced the luxurious suite that had become her prison, secure communication devices spreading across every available surface, as she tried to coordinate with officials in 3 different countries. The Austrian government had been gracious hosts, but she could sense their growing discomfort with her extended presence. Captain Morrison entered with another intelligence briefing, his expression grimmer than usual. Your Highness, we've received the proposal from Queen Vivienne regarding the Red Cross mission, he said. Isabella stopped pacing. And? It could work. Cardinal Benedetti has significant influence, and the humanitarian angle provides political cover that pure diplomatic channels lack. Morrison paused. But the conditions? I know what the conditions are, Isabella said quietly. Vivienne gets exactly what she's wanted all along, my complete removal from British royal duties with perfect justification. Your Highness, with respect, perhaps that's not the most important consideration right now. Your people need you. Isabella walked to the window overlooking the Vienna skyline. Morrison was right, of course. Her duty to Astoria had to take precedence over court politics, but the thought of returning to find her life's work dismantled was almost unbearable. Captain, I need you to be completely honest with me. If I accept this mission and spend months in Astoria with the Red Cross, what will be left of my position when I return? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Your marriage will survive. Prince Alexander loves you deeply, and that won't change. Your popularity with the British public remains strong, but in terms of influence within the royal establishment, I'll be starting from scratch, Isabella finished. Possibly worse than that, Your Highness. Queen Vivienne will have months to establish new precedents, new alliances, new ways of doing things. Changing course once she's consolidated power will be extremely difficult. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Save her homeland but lose her adopted one. Or preserve her position while people died in a war she might be able to help end. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Alexander. She answered immediately, desperate to hear his voice. Isabella, have you considered the Red Cross proposal? I've been thinking about little else, she replied. Alexander, if I do this, I need to know that you'll fight to preserve what we've built together. I'm trying, Alexander said, and she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. But Vivienne is skilled at making her changes appear reasonable and temporary. Every time I oppose something, she frames it as putting personal preferences above the monarchy's stability. And your father? Alexander's pause told her everything she needed to know. King Edmund, for all his personal affection for Isabella, was more concerned with maintaining the appearance of unity than with protecting her specific initiatives. Isabella, Alexander continued, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support you completely. But I also need you to understand the reality here. Vivienne isn't just suspending your programs, she's replacing them with alternatives that serve her agenda. What do you mean? The literacy initiative has been replaced with a traditional values education program that focuses on heritage and history rather than practical skills. The mental health resources for young mothers have been restructured as family support services that emphasize conventional approaches. Isabella felt sick. Queen Vivienne was systematically undoing years of carefully planned progressive initiatives, replacing them with programs that reinforce traditional power structures and conservative social values. She's not just reversing my work, Isabella said. She's actively moving in the opposite direction. Yes, Alexander confirmed. And every day you're not here to counterbalance her influence. She gains more support from conservative elements within the government and the church. Isabella made her decision with the clarity that came from accepting an unavoidable sacrifice. Contact Cardinal Benedetti. Tell him, I accept the Red Cross mission. Isabella, are you certain? My people are dying, Alexander. I can rebuild programs and regain influence, but I can't bring back the dead. Her voice was steady, but Alexander could hear the pain beneath her composed words. I'll keep fighting for what we've built, he promised. I know you will. But Alexander, promise me something else. When I come back, don't let them make me feel like a stranger in my own home. The arrangements moved forward with the efficiency that characterized high-level diplomatic operations when powerful people aligned their interests. Within 48 hours, Isabella was aboard a Red Cross aircraft, her royal protection detail replaced by humanitarian security personnel. Her elegant travel wardrobe exchanged for practical field clothing. Queen Vivienne watched the departure coverage on the news from her private sitting room, surrounded by policy documents and organizational charts that mapped out the changes she intended to implement during Isabella's absence. Her expression remained perfectly composed, but those who knew her well might have detected a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Lord Pemberton, she said to her longtime advisor, I think we can accelerate the timeline for the education reforms. With Princess Isabella committed to humanitarian work indefinitely, there's no point in maintaining programs that lack proper oversight. Shall I draft the announcements? Pemberton asked. Not yet, Queen Vivienne replied thoughtfully. Let's wait a few weeks. Allow the public to adjust to Isabella's absence. Then we can present the changes as natural evolutions rather than abrupt reversals. It was a masterful long-term strategy. By the time Isabella returned from Astoria, the new programs would be established facts, defended by bureaucratic inertia, and supported by carefully cultivated constituencies. Prince Alexander, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated in his efforts to preserve his wife's legacy. Cabinet meetings became exercises in polite resistance to his suggestions, with ministers expressing concern about implementing new initiatives, while Princess Isabella focuses on her humanitarian mission. The breaking point came 3 months later, during a heated discussion about education policy. Alexander had proposed expanding literacy programs to include digital skills training, building on the foundation Isabella had established. Sir, Education Secretary Philip said with barely concealed impatience, we've restructured those programs to focus on core competencies and traditional skills. Adding technology components would require extensive review and retraining. That frankly seems premature, while the princess is unavailable to oversee implementation. The princess established these programs specifically to be sustainable in her absence, Alexander replied sharply. Queen Vivienne, who had been quietly reviewing documents during the exchange, looked up with an expression of gentle concern. Alexander, dear, perhaps you're placing too much pressure on yourself to maintain programs that were always intended as collaborative efforts. Isabella wouldn't want you to exhaust yourself trying to manage initiatives that require her specific expertise. It was perfectly phrased, supportive, caring, and utterly devastating to his position. She had positioned Isabella's programs as dependent on her personal involvement, rather than as sustainable policy initiatives. These aren't personal projects, Alexander said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain composed. They're crown policies with parliamentary support and public approval. Of course, Queen Vivienne agreed smoothly. Which is why we've been so careful to maintain their essential elements, while ensuring they operate efficiently during this transition period. The phrase transition period hung in the air with ominous implications. Queen Vivienne wasn't merely maintaining Isabella's programs during her absence. She was treating the absence as an opportunity to transition to an entirely different approach. Alexander left the meeting feeling more defeated than he had since Isabella's departure. That evening, he called her using the secure satellite connection that had become their lifeline. Isabella answered from a refugee camp outside the Astorian capital, where she had been spending her days distributing supplies and documenting war crimes for international prosecutors. The work was meaningful and necessary, but she could hear the strain in Alexander's voice immediately. How bad is it? She asked without preamble. She's not just changing policies, Alexander said. She's changing the entire philosophy of the monarchy's role in social issues. Everything we built was based on the idea that royalty should actively promote progress and change. She's reverting to the model where we simply preserve tradition and support existing institutions. And your father? Supports her completely. He sees it as a return to proven approaches during uncertain times. 7Ds problems, Kurpsen times problems. Isabella sat in her small tent, listening to the sounds of the refugee camp around her children playing despite everything they had lost. Adults discussing plans to rebuild their lives, the constant hum of generators keeping essential services running. The contrast between the immediate human needs she was addressing and the abstract political maneuvering happening in London felt surreal. "Alexander," she said finally, "I need you to do something that's going to be very difficult. Anything. I need you to stop fighting her." Alexander was quiet for so long that Isabella wondered if the connection had been lost. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Vivienne is winning because she's forcing you to fight on her terms, within systems she understands better than we do. Every time you oppose her directly, she gets to position herself as the reasonable voice of experience, while you appear emotional and unstable. So I should just let her destroy everything we've worked for?" "No," Isabella said firmly. "You should start building something new, something she can't co-opt or undermine because it doesn't exist within the traditional power structures she knows how to manipulate." Alexander felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "What do you have in mind?" "The future of the monarchy isn't in competing with politicians over policy details," Isabella said. "It's in building direct relationships with people, creating platforms for change that don't depend on government approval or court politics." She outlined a strategy that was both revolutionary and utterly practical. Instead of fighting Queen Vivienne for control of existing programs, Alexander would begin developing new initiatives that operated outside traditional royal channels, partnerships with technology companies to create educational apps, collaborations with international organizations on environmental issues, direct engagement with young people through social media and digital platforms. "Vivienne can control what happens in cabinet meetings and state ceremonies," Isabella explained. "But she can't control what happens when you appear on university campuses, or speak at technology conferences, or partner with startups working on social innovation." "It's brilliant," Alexander said, his voice containing genuine excitement for the first time in months. "But will I be able to implement something like this without your direct involvement?" Isabella smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Alexander, you've been so focused on preserving my work that you've forgotten something important. I fell in love with you because you had your own vision for what the monarchy could become. This is your chance to show the world that vision." 6 months later, when Isabella finally returned to London after helping negotiate a ceasefire that ended the Asturian Civil War, she found a transformed landscape. Queen Vivienne had indeed succeeded in dismantling most of Isabella's original programs, replacing them with traditional alternatives that reinforced conservative values and established power structures. But she also found something unexpected. Alexander had become a different kind of prince, one who operated as much outside the palace as within it. His technology partnerships had created educational tools used by millions of young people worldwide. His environmental initiatives had established Britain as a leader in sustainable royal practices. His direct engagement with youth organizations had created a global network of young leaders who saw the British monarchy as a force for progressive change. Queen Vivienne watched Isabella's return from the same blue drawing room where the crisis had begun. And for the first time in months, her composed expression showed signs of concern. She had won the battle for control of traditional royal functions, but she was beginning to realize that the war for the monarchy's future was being fought on entirely different terrain. Isabella and Alexander's reunion was private, away from cameras and protocol, in the same study where they had said goodbye nearly a year earlier. They held each other without speaking for a long time, both understanding that they had been through a transformation that would define the rest of their lives together. "I'm sorry about your programs," Alexander said finally. "I'm proud of what you've built," Isabella replied. "You've shown that we don't need Vivienne's permission to change the world." As they stood together, looking out at the gardens of Ravencourt Palace, both knew that their marriage had survived its greatest test. But more than that, They had discovered that their true power didn't come from their positions within the traditional royal hierarchy. It came from their ability to envision and create something entirely new. Queen Vivian's victory had been complete within the narrow confines of court politics, but the future, they now understood, would be decided far beyond the palace walls, in spaces where ancient protocols held no power, and where the only authority that mattered was the ability to inspire others to believe in change. The tearful goodbye that had shattered Prince Alexander and allowed Queen Vivian to walk away with a smirk had ultimately created something neither woman had anticipated: a partnership strong enough to reinvent what it meant to be royal. In the modern world,